Hello, my name is Kyle Toner, and I'll be talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how it correlates to the topics we've talked about in this course. A little background on the conflict is that in 1991, Ukraine gained its independence from the Soviet Union, but Russia continued to view Ukraine as being a part of its sphere of influence. In 2014, Russian forces invaded and annexed Crimea, which is a peninsula connected to Ukraine that caused violence throughout eastern Ukraine and marked the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian War. This conflict shifted to a standstill, but further chaos occurred a few years later when the United States monitored Russia and noticed a possible mass-scaled invasion of Ukraine. In 2022, President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, declared the beginning of a complete land, sea, and air invasion of Ukraine, which targeted Ukrainian military assets and cities across the country. The conflict is still occurring today and is seen as the deadliest war in Europe since World War II. Realism plays an important role in understanding Russia's viewpoint throughout the whole invasion. Realism is defined as a school of thought that explains international relations in terms of power and can be characterized through anarchy, sovereignty, hegemony, and power. Anarchy is a system that lacks a central authority where the strong survive and the weak get absorbed or are dominated. This idea is prevalent with Russia since it continued with its plans for invading Ukraine when outside forces told them not to. The United Nations and United States condemned Russia for wanting to invade Ukraine, but was not able to do anything to stop the conflict since they believed further intervention would cause the conflict to spread. Sovereignty explains how each state has a right to security from outside influences. Since Ukraine left the Soviet Union back in 1991, it's been deemed a sovereign state and earns the power to make its own decisions. Ukraine's primary goal was to join NATO and align with the West since its values were more similar than Russia's. However, Russia continued to view Ukraine as a part of its sphere of influence after gaining its independence. This caused Russia to put pressure on Ukraine so they couldn't join NATO, and Russia's authoritarian views ignored Ukraine's sovereignty to gain what it wanted, which was to stop NATO expansion and maintaining its sphere of influence. With hegemony, it is defined as the dominance of one state over others. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union happening after the Cold War, it led the United States to become a unipolar power within the world. The United States pushed for NATO expansion throughout the globe, which caused Russia to take the offensive stance and protect Ukraine from Western hegemony, disregarding if Ukraine wanted to join them in the first place. Putin saw NATO expansion as a threat to Russia's independence and believed invading Ukraine would show its independence towards the West. This would go towards Russia's plans in counteracting against Western hegemony and protecting its border states. Lastly, power is defined as getting another state to do what it would not have done or preventing to do what it wanted to do. Russia used force or hard power to make Ukraine not do what it wanted to do, which was to align with the West. In addition, Ukraine used soft power since Western allies chose to aid Ukraine in order to combat the conflict. As I said before about unipolarity, Russia believes that multipolarity is better than the US having dominant power, even if it is viewed as the least stable power distribution. Overall, realism is very important in understanding Russia's standpoint throughout the conflict. On the other hand, liberalism can help us understand Ukraine's standpoint throughout the whole invasion. Liberalism argues that international institutions can allow nations to successfully cooperate within the international system. It's believed that states having close ties with one another will lead to less conflicts and can be best described through democracy, cooperation, and economic interdependence. Liberalism believes in the idea of democratic peace theory, which is based on the idea that democracies don't go to war with each other. Since Russia's advances of Ukraine pose a threat to Ukrainian democracy, Western allies, who are predominantly democratic governments, have helped aid Ukraine with the ongoing conflict. With cooperation, in this case refers to international institutions like NATO, who provided military aid in Ukraine to combat Russian advances. Another group that helps Ukraine is the ICC, or the International Criminal Court, which I'll talk more about later. And lastly, economic interdependence is when the economic activities of one country are influenced by activities from other countries. The ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine led to trade disruptions between countries. This caused the West to place heavy sanctions on Russia so it wouldn't continue funding the conflict. Additionally, other countries showed liberalism by diversifying trade partners and overall aiding Ukraine in order to combat the conflict. Another concept we learned throughout this course are the different levels of analysis, which are used to emphasize international law, morality, and international organizations as key influences on international events. The main actors are Putin and Zelensky, which are the primary rulers of Russia and Ukraine, as well as the United Nations for making decisions on how to aid Ukraine during the conflict. The interstate or international level of analysis is best in describing the Russia-Ukraine conflict through power, wars, and alliance formation and dissolution. As I previously explained, Russia wants power to ensure survival and become a dominant global power within a post-Soviet sphere and combating against Western hegemony. These ideas are in addition to the ideas of realism. With wars, the 2014 annexing of Crimea marks the beginning of the end of Russia and Ukraine interactions or allegiance. The more recent conflicts occurring in 2022 between Russia and Ukraine is still occurring today and shows the decade-long feud between the two countries. Lastly, with alliance formation, it can correspond with Western allies and international institutions siding with Ukraine and aiding them with fighting the conflict. Additionally, dissolution can also be used since Russia is trying to navigate itself after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, trying to show itself as a dominant force. Additionally, the domestic level of analysis can also help us understand the Russia-Ukraine conflict through nationalism, types of government, and economic sectors and industries. Nationalism is important towards Russia, and I'll talk more about that later. With types of government, Russia has an authoritarian stance, meaning the power lies in the hands of one person or a small group. In this case, the power lies in their president, Vladimir Putin. Additionally, Ukraine has a democratic government since leaving the Soviet Union, having people vote for a president and a legislative process, all the necessities needed for a democracy. And lastly, economic sectors and industries can refer to the sanctions placed on Russia's assets to not continue funding the ongoing conflict. This impacted Russia's energy exports and military tech and overall put a decline in Russia's economy. International law is the framework of rules and standards that governs the interactions between other legally recognized international organizations. Groups such as NATO and the United Nations have condemned Russia for its plans on invading Ukraine. Since Russia followed through with the invasion, it's considered to have broken international law, which led to Western allies placing sanctions on Russia to combat the conflict. Now with the ICC, or International Criminal Court, it placed an investigation on Russia for its violations on Ukraine, putting a warrant out for Putin's arrest. The organization has worked with various institutions such as the Ukrainian police, military, etc. to help Ukraine. Although the ICC has limited jurisdiction regarding the conflict, they've used their power to hold accountable the higher-ups in enforcing international law. Another concept we talked about in this course is just war theory and just war approach. Just war approach explicitly rules out war as an instrument to change another state's government or policies or for ethnic or religious conflicts. The two rules of just war theory is just in bellum and just in bello. Just ad bellum is a concept in just war theory that explains war as a last resort. War is declared by a legitimate authority and waged in self-defense or to establish or restore justice. It's lastly fought to bring back peace. Russia doesn't follow this rule since it started the invasion not as a last resort and not under self-defense, but as a means of taking back what they deemed was historically theirs. Ukraine, however, does follow this idea since the aid provided from foreign countries has been used to combat the conflict as a means of self-defense. The second rule, just in bello, within just war theory, explains the proportionality of a forced threat. Violence must not correlate with discrimination or making non-combatants intentional targets. And additionally, law and morality remain highly controversial. Russia doesn't follow this rule since the scope and scale of conflict didn't match with what Ukraine has done to Russia, that being the attempt of joining the West. Ukraine, however, mostly follows this rule, but can be deemed using unnecessary violence and should remain accountable for any violations they've made throughout the conflict. Lastly, the various types of conflicts we've discussed throughout the course can help us explain the extent of the Russian-Ukraine conflict through territorial disputes, nationalism, hegemony, and economic conflict. The annexation of Crimea is a good example of territorial disputes. The population of Crimea is predominantly Russian, which was justification for Putin in deciding to take over the region. International groups viewed the annexation as illegal, but Russia believed it was historically right to reclaim the land. Since this, Ukraine has refused to renounce its claims of sovereignty over territories occupied by Russia, specifically Crimea, since they didn't only view the land for its economic benefits, but as a means of independence. Since then, Russia annexed 4 other regions of Ukraine and asked them to recognize the Russian territory claims on them. As of today, Russia is still taking over Ukrainian land with no means of an end at the moment. With nationalism, it emphasizes the feeling of devotion towards the interest of one's own nation over others. With the video we had to watch on the Ukraine proxy war, it's a good example of showing Russia's lack of care for ending the conflict by breaking ceasefire agreements like the Minsk agreement and deeming its priorities more important than the needs of other countries. This directly correlates to Russia wanting to keep Ukraine in its sphere of influence and breaking hegemonic patterns within the West. Speaking of hegemony, which I talked earlier about, can be seen since Russia wants to become independently dominant and break Western hegemony patterns. Russia believes that taking back Ukraine will reassert itself as a global power within a post-Soviet sphere. Lastly, with economic conflicts, they've occurred through trade disruptions and causing the world to have to diversify their trade. With this, sanctions have played a heavy role in trying to stop Russia from attacking Ukraine. Although these sanctions have impacted Russia's production of goods and revenue, it still hasn't caused Russia's economy to collapse or stop Russian aggression against Ukraine. That's the end of this presentation. Throughout this course, I've learned a lot and especially been able to apply it to this conflict specifically. I feel like the most prominent factor throughout this conflict is the idea of realism and liberalism, just because both countries seem to show both sides of it and how that dynamic can sort of play out. And overall, these concepts have helped me understand why the Russia-Ukraine conflict is still happening today and how it's overall impacting the world.